enforcement activity, as well as all the staff notices that have been floating around. A few housekeeping matters before we get started. As you just heard, we are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you following today's session. We appreciate your time and welcome your questions throughout today's session. Please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you may have for our panelists. And just to be ultra sure, we have allotted 15 minutes at the end of today's session to address any questions that you may have throughout the conversation. One quick note, some of us are working from home, so you may hear periodically some background noise. We appreciate your understanding to begin with. To get us started, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. If I could ask Tom for you to start.
Sure, Param. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this webinar. I'm Tom Selman. I'm founder of Scopus Financial Group. We provide regulatory and compliance consulting to broker-dealers, trade associations, investment advisors. Before forming this company in 2020, I retired as Executive Vice President at FINRA for regulatory policy and FINRA's legal compliance officer. I was at FINRA for 23 years.
Thank you, Tom. Issa, do you mind going next?
Sure, happy to. And, thanks Param and the folks at InvestorCOM for putting this together. And, thanks for having me. And thanks everybody for joining us today. So my name is Issa Hanna. I'm a partner at Eversheds Sutherland. I sit on our investment services and products team here at the firm. And I work with broker-dealers, investment advisors, insurance distributors of all shapes and sizes regarding broker-dealer and investment advisor and state insurance regulatory issues. And I've been focusing particularly over the last few years on broker-dealer investment advisor standard of conduct issues. So happy to be here today.
Thank you, Issa. We appreciate you being a panelist. Ben, may I ask you to introduce yourself next?
Sure. So my name is Ben Westin. I'm the CCO for Regulus Financial Group. We're a BD based out of the Grand Rapids, Michigan area with an affiliated RIA. So just here to talk a little bit about different regulatory landscape items that have come up and how we've been handling them.
Thank you, Ben. Mr. Barnes.
Thank you, Param. Hey, everybody. Randy Barnes, Director of our Product Engineering here at InvestorCOM. By way of background, have spent about 25 years in the wealth management fintech space, trying to help broker-dealers, self-clearing BDs, introducing BDs, RIAs, become more efficient and improve their processes through technology. So hoping to add some of that value here today.
Thank you, Randy. And folks, my name is Param Nasseri. I am the moderator for today's session and head of regulatory strategy here at InvestorCOM. And if you haven't met InvestorCOM, we are a leading regulatory software provider for the wealth management space across North America. You may have come across our software, and it's known in the space for its award-winning intuitive design that helps firms not only mitigate compliance risks, but also grow their business. So without further ado, let's jump into the thick of things. On the discussion today, we're going to have a multifaceted, multi-layered regulatory conversation, and we'll aim to cover what we are seeing in the marketplace across different landscapes. What are regulators looking for in terms of Reg BI compliance? What have we seen in terms of examinations, enforcement activity, as well as market guidance or staff notices to date? We'll explore leveraging regulations as a core component to your firm's growth and compliance strategy. And finally, we'll take a more practical approach or practical look at how technology can be leveraged to enhance your growth and compliance across your organization. And as I said off the top, we've allotted time to address any questions you may have throughout today's conversation. Okay. over the course of, I wanted to say, the past 2 years or so, we've been bringing the wealth and compliance communities together to better understand how you and your peers are tackling specific regulatory initiatives. And prior to today's session, we asked a few poll questions, and here's a quick summary of what you've responded. So we began by asking, what are you seeing on the Reg BI enforcement side? What do you anticipate to be the most significant area of enforcement, I should say? And as you can see, there's a little bit of a toss-up between form CRS delivery, the assessment of reasonably available alternatives, which is probably one of the most talked about terms in our industry over the past 2 years, as well as rollover recommendations. Then we asked, do you have a process for making best interest product recommendations, best interest rollover recommendations, and account recommendations? And folks, as you can see on the screen, there is a sense of consistency in how firms have tackled these requirements, which is probably not news to many, but as you can see, it is by and large a relatively manual and PDF heavy experience across the board. Now, given the responses there, we asked, why have you not adopted technology to meet the Department of Labor's requirements, Reg BI's requirements? And as you can see, the responses are centered around the age-old limited resources and time response, as well as the fact that there is that manual PDF process in play. We certainly hope you found insight in some of these results. We hope that you continue to engage with us and leverage some of the data points that we've been able to garner through our industry travel. Now, without further ado, let's jump into our panelist conversation. Tom, maybe I can begin with you. We're now 2 years in the Reg BI regime. As you said off the top, as a former executive heading up regulatory policy at FINRA, do you believe Reg BI has met its intended purpose?
Well, Param, even though we're a little over 2 years into the implementation, Reg BI is still in its infancy. We don't know exactly how the SEC is going to interpret different aspects of Reg BI, how aggressively it will enforce and how it will enforce Reg BI, or how FINRA will do this as well. And how, if there's a change in administration, for example, and you have a different SEC, how things might change. Having said that, I should also say, I mean, your poll survey, I think, also indicates that Reg BI is also in its infancy, even in the compliance shops of firms, because I think many firms are going to decide it's much easier to have a technology and a good application to make their decisions much more consistent concerning Reg BI than a manual process. So I think the regulation's in its infancy, both from the perspective of the regulator and the perspective of compliance shops. Having said all that, Reg BI did accomplish important goals. It established principles by which recommendations to retail investors would be made. It brought the standards for broker dealers up to a standard that's on par with the fiduciary standard for investment advisors, without actually imposing a fiduciary standard that would have crushed the commission business. It didn't impose undue detailed requirements that would have hampered the ability to comply with these principles. And I think if it's allowed to, it really put to rest the whole concern about the absence of a fiduciary standard for broker dealers by imposing a best interest standard that really is in some ways it's even stricter than what applies to investment advisors. So at this point, it appears to have met its objectives, but as I said at the beginning, it's still in its infancy.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Tom. Now, there's been a tremendous amount of headlines, both across the Reg BI journey and most recently about the SEC asking Congress for additional funding, possibly to ramp up Reg BI examinations. Tom, what do you make of that particular request to Congress?
As a taxpayer, or as a person who advises broker dealers, as a taxpayer, I'm sure they could find the money. But from the perspective of firms, obviously, the SEC is just getting started in its enforcement. We know that there's a case that they filed that we can talk about, and there are other cases in the works under Reg BI. And the cases are not going to just deal with minor compliance issues. They're probably going to deal with how products are recommended and how the care obligation is not met in these cases in the view of the commission staff. So they will dedicate resources to this effort. I think this current SEC, I do not believe is going to try to amend the rule. I think they've shown that already, but I think they will try to bring the cases to make that rule to make Reg BI be read as expansively as possible, as close to a fiduciary standard as possible. And they're going to need enforcement cases to do that.
Thanks, Tom. And let me bring Issa into the conversation. Issa, another one of the initiatives that we've gleaned recently in the headlines is the SEC's strategic priorities, and or the draft strategic priorities, where they've indicated a renewed focus on recommendations, quote unquote. What do you make of this?
So what they said specifically in that that report on their strategic priorities is that they plan to bring cases for failure to act in retail customers' best interest when making recommendations. At first blush, that might sound kind of generic or non-controversial, but I will say, I think just reading between the lines here, I think what they seem to be saying is that their intent is to kind of move past the low-hanging fruit type of cases and really start to show people how that Reg BI best interest standard of conduct works in action. And I think Tom is absolutely right that the request for additional funding it really ties into this intent or plan by the staff at the SEC to illustrate for the industry, through enforcement, how they intend to regulate firms under Reg BI. I think there's every indication at this point that they plan to take the same regulation by enforcement approach under Reg BI that they've historically taken under the Advisors Act fiduciary duty. So, that's essentially how I read, that language in that report is that, they plan to, bring cases on this, and not just for the sake of, slapping people on the wrist with technical violations of Reg BI, but for the purpose of sending a message and to illustrate, that new principles-based regime that folks have to grapple with now under Reg BI. And I think, that message that they plan to kind of focus on, best interest recommendations and specifically, compliance with the care obligation, I think it's consistent with other messages that the SEC and the staff has been sending. You have, a bulletin that came out that the staff put out back in March that focused on account type recommendations and rollover recommendations. I think it's no coincidence that they chose to focus the first bulletin in this series on the care obligation. And I think it's also consistent with the first case they brought, which was largely under the care obligation. We'll be talking more about that case later on, but all of this kind of looking at it all together at a high level indicates, number one, that they plan to enforce Reg BI vigorously, and that folks have to keep their keep tabs on the cases that come out, to see how this principles-based regime is developing. And number two, I think folks have to pay attention to the care obligation specifically, because that seems to be the area that that they're focusing on and that has the most, I think, room for interpretation.
Thanks, Issa, and I really like the way you framed that. Now, with your points around specific focus on the care obligation, I think there's consistency in what you're saying and what Tom has shared. I wonder if there is this, you bring in the Department of Labor's purview and focus on, obviously investment recommendations and to retirement investors, and the focus on rollovers. You combine that with the SEC's focus on the care obligation, which also encompasses, as you pointed out, account recommendations and rollovers. What do you make of the specific degree of scrutiny around, effectively, if you want to call it pre-trade recommendation activity across the wealth management space?
I mean, I would say in general, the approach that they're taking is prove it to me. Prove to me that you have, you've met your obligations, to act in this customer's best interest. And how do you prove it? Prove it without, contemporaneous documentation. I think that's really what they're looking for. So I would say overall, there is, just kind of like this real focus on, compliance with the care obligation, and they're not just looking at your policies and procedures. They're looking at, things on a recommendation by recommendation basis, and specifically, they're looking for documentation associated with each recommendation to show that, you have a process, number one, but that you also follow that process on a consistent basis with respect to each recommendation.
Issa, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you for sharing that. And now, so we've got Tom and Issa sharing their views on the interpretation and what they're seeing in the marketplace around these regulations. Ben, you sit on the other side of these regulations, which is actually implementing them, and meaning you actually have to put them into action. Maybe if you don't mind starting the conversation and sharing with our audience, what are the approaches you've taken across your firm to tackling these specific regulations?
Sure. So I think back to what Issa said, I think, the important thing here is having a process and then making sure you follow it within your principal review steps. So, what we've done is we've engaged with the InvestorCOM team to sort of stack on some technology solutions, whether that be the shelf monitor for just the shelf itself, or then rolling that into the peer compare and rollover analyzer tools themselves, but making sure that our field force sort of understands, one, the regulation, two, what we've done to sort of cover ourselves and them with regards to the technology, and then making sure they understand sort of what we're looking for when they actually send paperwork for that recommendation up through our system. And then if they don't, or there's something missing, that we're having sort of those active conversations with them about what we need with regards to, reasonably available alternatives, what sort of analysis we want to see on file, and then ultimately, what makes us comfortable with the recommendation itself. And then from there, it's just continuing to have conversations with folks in the industry about what they're seeing, what exams are focusing on, making sure we're paying attention to what's coming out as far as enforcement, and then taking that and using it as a lens for our own process to make sure that, when we ultimately get the microscope on us from the SEC or FINRA, whatever it is, that, we're comfortable with our process and sort of able to have conversations about it and ultimately defend it should any issues come up.
And thank you for sharing that. And you said it in your own words, and Issa said it in his words around contemporaneous documentation. So, yeah. Randy, let me put the mic in front of you for a quick second. I know over the past few months, you've played a very critical role in helping our clients and prospects meet the specific requirements across the industry. Are there any general trends that you're seeing around FINRA and the SEC examinations as they relate to Reg BI?
Yeah, and it's pretty consistent with what we've been hearing from Tom and Issa and Ben this whole time, which is front and center. One of the first things they're asked about, or they're called to the carpet on, is their Reg BI process, their policy procedures, and to Issa's point, their the application of them. So it's very clear to me, just through talking to the clients, that this is going to be a big thing. Also, we've been, I was fortunate enough to go down to Charlotte recently for the CNL seminar, and almost every session, from the opening remarks to the closing remarks and everything in between, had some level of discussion around Reg BI, whether it be from SIFMA or from the SEC or FINRA, but it was a topic in every session. And one of the SEC representatives there, I think to one of the points before, even used the phrase, they're really digging in like they're going beyond the cursory review, and they're gonna to really zoom in, I think, which emphasizes their ask for additional spend. I mean, this is all, just something that's going to ramp up. And then one last piece to close out, I think something that you just mentioned about the contemporaneous documentation and everything else. In the same conference, one of the folks talked about how important it is to have this level of documentation to help avoid this concept of hindsight bias, right? They come in 6 to 9 months and ask you why you did something before, and it's very easy for them to point to the results and question why you did it. And if you don't have that level of documentation to prove it out, you're going to kind of be at their mercy. So just wanted to kind of bring that to light, that it's not just us talking about it here. They're talking about it on those panels as well. And these are, industry peers, SEC, FINRA, everybody's bringing up these same type of topics.
Thanks, Randy. So maybe there were some references around sort of the guidance pieces or staff notices that the SEC and FINRA have shed light on through the past 2 years. Issa, maybe we can start there and talk about kind of the steady flow of information from the regulators, as you highlighted the most, in March, the notice around account type and rollover recommendations. As a matter of general practice, what do you believe the general purpose of these guidance notes or staff notices are?
Just in their words, they kind of at the front of these staff bulletins, say a couple things as to why they're sharing this guidance. The first is just to say these are our views. These are the views of the staff. So essentially, I think they're trying to be transparent about where they are, so that you can plan ahead for the inevitable exams that that are going to come to pass for compliance with Reg BI and the Advisors Act fiduciary duty. So that's one aspect of it. Whether their views are consistent with the actual commission guidance that you'll find within Reg BI or the Advisors Act fiduciary duty interpretation is a different matter, because again, these are staff views, not commission views. So you can quibble with that, but these are the views that you can expect to hear when at the minimum when you start dealing with examiners from the SEC's Division of Exams. The second thing that they say as part of the staff bulletins, as to why they're issuing them. They say that generally speaking, they're designed to provide guidance to assist firms as they comply with the specific requirements under the standards of conduct. And in the first bulletin that was issued relating to account type and rollover recommendations, they say specifically that we're doing this to provide more specific guidance around the consideration of reasonably available alternatives and cost, addressing conflicts in connection with these types of recommendations, and implementing reasonably designed policies and procedures to fulfill requirements under Reg BI's compliance obligation.
Now, so let's just double click on that a little bit. I know you and I have chatted about this, Issa, quite a bit. What do you believe, what do you read from sort of the particular focus on account and rollover recommendations? Is there a reason why that was the first staff notice that was published?
Again, I think it just reflects that the reality that the staff is kind of putting a priority on the care obligation. I don't think it was a coincidence that the first staff bulletin focused almost entirely on the care obligation. The first case that came out was largely a care obligation case. I don't think that was a coincidence. I think they're trying to send a message here. But in general, I think a lot of these, requirements under Reg BI's care obligation are a bit of a moving target. I think the unfortunate reality here is that the real and actionable guidance is really going to develop through enforcement actions as opposed to FAQs. At the end of the day, a lot of the FAQs that the staff provided in these bulletins was a bit still unsatisfying. Especially when it comes to the specific, I think, alternatives you should be considering in connection with specific types of products. But I think for now, the best thing you can do is show good faith a real, good faith attempt to comply. Make sure your people are actually following through on the processes that you've established. So if you require them to complete some sort of narrative discussion in your forms, requiring them to give like an explanation as to what other products they considered and why they chose what they chose and why that was the best option. Make sure they're doing that. Make sure what they say is not in template form. They're not repeating the same thing over and over again. Give them specific ideas through training as to what they might consider in particular situations. And finally, just document with connection with every single recommendation. Make sure that you have a paper trail to show what the basis was for that recommendation.
Thanks, Issa. I really appreciate that. And that commentary around document is something we're hearing quite loudly through our client experience and journey as well. Maybe before I jump and ask Randy a quick question, let me just make a quick pause and again, invite folks to engage with us, ask any questions you might have. We have allotted plenty of time to tackle them throughout today's conversation. So this is a great opportunity. You've got wonderful panelists who clearly know this subject matter really, really well. Now, Randy, you faced queries from our clients around account recommendations, especially more recently. How are they, in your respective view, tackling this today? And what are they looking for if there was a digital solution out there?
Yeah, so the vast majority, then this is evidenced, I think, in our poll questions, no coincidence. They're doing something manual, and what we're seeing a lot of the time is they're doing something within their new account opening process. They're introducing some level of process procedure to address it at that point. This could be something as simple as capturing notes in their CRM for that client as far as what their discussion was, which has its own pros and cons around leveraging some free-form note capability and getting access to that and monitoring and surveilling that or supervising that. And it could extend into their manual PDF new account opening form or their actual account opening system, if they have an integrated system for something like that. So we're hearing it run the gamut on all of those. And as we kind of tease apart the conversation, no secret, what they're looking for is what everybody is hopefully looking for in a digital solution. It's kind of the holy grail, right? It's how integrated can it be? Is it intuitive? Is it easy to use? Is it going to be easy to adopt? I hear Issa's comment about document. And in my ear, I'm hearing, well, that's really hard. That's really hard. That's going to slow down my sales practice. That's going to make me take more time to do something. And so adoption is going to be a really big challenge that, that we're hearing for sure. And then, the other kicker is making sure that what they're chasing is going to be efficient and effective for both the advisor as well as their home office staff on the compliance and supervision side. So, that's a delicate balance to get that right, but that's what they're looking for.
Took a second to find the mute button, but found it. Thank you, Randy. Let me quickly take a second here just to share. Once, if I can go to the next screen here. Folks, with all this discussion around account type recommendations, I'll take a quick pause to announce that we are launching a new product in the coming weeks for financial professionals to assess and document the rationale around their best interest account recommendations. As you will see in a second, if you are interested in hearing more about this solution, please hit us up. There's check out our website and you can ask for a quick demo and we'll reach out to you and talk a bit more about this particular solution. Now, we've talked a lot about the general workflows involved in making recommendations. Let's turn the table and talk a little bit about the enforcement activity we've seen to date. Tom, maybe I can ask you to bring your insights into the conversation here. So far, we've seen one enforcement activity by the SEC. I know you have read this in detail. Any insights or any highlights that you want to share with our audience today?
Sure. So the SEC filed a case in federal court in June concerning alleged violation of the care obligation. The basic complaint concerned the sale of what were called L bonds, which were corporate bonds that were not secured in an issuer that had financial problems. And the allegation was that the broker dealer and the individual broker should have understood or seen the red flags concerning the issuer. These were allegedly sold to people who are not sophisticated, who had moderate or conservative investment strategies, who were in retirement. So I believe some were sold into retirement accounts. So it's a fairly classic set of facts that could have been brought under the suitability rule. But that's not to say that there are notable features, that there aren't notable features that are distinguishable from the suitability rule. In particular, I'd like to point out a few. First of all, I think there's an expectation, as revealed by the complaint, of a lot more specificity under Reg BI. The complaint discusses the fact that the firm and the rep did not indicate why these products were in the best interest of the client, did not document why. Generally, in suitability cases, the question was simply whether a product is suitable for any customer and suitable for the customer to whom it was recommended. I don't recall such an emphasis on the demonstration as in this case that a product was in the best interest of the customer with documentation. Similarly, there was an expectation that there be specific supervisory procedures on illiquid products. These L bonds were illiquid. Again, there was an expectation of a certain specificity that may not have been necessary or expected in any suitability enforcement case. There was an expectation that the firm and the rep specifically consider reasonably available alternatives, and again justify the conclusion that there were none. And document that. Again, greater specificity. So these are examples, I think, of what the approach might be, both for the examination group and for the enforcement division at the SEC, and probably FINRA as well, to say, well, yeah, the principles are similar to suitability, but we're going to make them much more specific and clear. And we want to see documentation that you actually went through the care obligation with respect to this recommendation, the specific recommendation. Another feature I think is significant is the increased emphasis, I think, in Reg BI on the obligations of the individual financial advisor. Obviously, under the suitability rule, under FINRA's traditional sales practice rules, the financial advisor, the broker-dealer rep, has all sorts of responsibilities to comply with the suitability rule and other sales practice rules. This complaint, though, really emphasizes the significance of the individual's responsibility, and that this problem particularly comes up in the due diligence that was conducted by the firm on the L bonds. There was a due diligence report. I think they may have hired a third party to prepare a report, but it wasn't given to the supervisor of the rep, and it wasn't given to the reps who sold these bonds. And that was considered a major problem. Now, again, I think under the suitability rule, we would have a similar failure to supervise if something like that happened. But this approach seems to be quite consistent with the expectations under Reg BI for mitigation and of conflicts and for compliance with the care obligation by the individual rep. So those are some of the characteristics of the complaint. Now, it is just a complaint. It hasn't gone to trial. But I think it does reveal some features of how the SEC and probably FINRA will look at the care obligation.
Tom, thank you for that in-depth insights into, to your point, the first regulatory enforcement activity related to Reg BI. Issa, I know you and your team have broken down this this enforcement activity as well. And anything that comes to mind that you want to share with our audience?
I mean, I think Tom did a great job kind of summing it up. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, the case could have easily been brought under the, you know, the old FINRA suitability standard, but you know, if you read the case, you know, closely, you know, I think there's a real illustration there of what they mean by principles based, and I think what they mean is these real specifics around, you know, the text of the policies and procedures that should have been adopted. You know, what kind of you know, content there should have been there. The fact that, you know, this individual, you know, chief compliance officer, you know, should have shared, you know, his diligence report with other people, that type of thing. I mean, it's just that level of, you know, specificity and you know, those heightened expectations, I think are, you know, a good illustration of what, you know, what the SEC is now getting at when it says that, you know, the Reg BI, you know, standard of conduct imposes a principles-based regime. You know, it's flexible. It allows for a certain level of interpretation depending on the circumstances. And, you know, while the case could have been brought into the suitability regime, I think there, you know, just looking at the case, there's still indications there that, you know, and clues as to how they plan to kind of go forward, which is, you know, with a, you know, an approach to, you know, regulation where they're going to kind of put out standards, you know, through enforcement actions as opposed to, you know, specific rules, and also that, you know, you're going to have to kind of keep, you know, tabs on big cases, you know, cases that really move the needle in terms of real expectations, and adjust as you go. So that's, you know, that was my real takeaway from the case was, you know, it's just a harbinger of what's to come. You know, whatever you've been doing on the IA fiduciary duty side to kind of keep your policies and procedures up with best practices, you're going to have to follow the same approach going forward on the Reg BI side in the future.
Yeah, Issa also made a point earlier about, you know, when you use a manual process in particular, you might use a template to describe why a product was in the best interest. So you tend to use the same language over and over. I think this case would show that if you use a manual process and you try to do something like that, it's going to be a big problem, because the staff expects you to make the individual consideration of how this particular recommendation was in the customer's best interest. And if it looks like you're just using boilerplate, you're not going to succeed.
Tom and Issa, thank you for shedding light on this very important enforcement activity. Ben, I hope you're taking notes. So, you know, both of you have said this enforcement activity really sheds light on the sort of the principles-based nature of the regulations. Meanwhile, there has been a lot of sort of adjacent market rhetoric around the importance of rollover recommendations. Just going across the board, and Issa, maybe to your comment about kind of potentially not using templated forms and analyses, how do you bring this all together when it comes to making compliant rollover recommendations to meet not just the care obligation, but the Department of Labor's PTE requirements?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what I'm about to say here is kind of equally applicable. You know, under, you know, both the, you know, Reg BI standard, the DOL standard, just because, you know, the DOL standard, you know, and it's, you know, and those impartial conduct standards kind of allow you to comply through compliance with Reg BI, right? So, you know, I would say really look to and you know, digest the specifics in, you know, the staff bulletin that came out back in March. There are very specific recommendations in there on things like, you know, the particular, you know, investor profile information that you need to be collecting in connection with rollover recommendations specifically, right? So you want to take a look at, you know, your account opening, you know, an account documentation process to make sure that, your your investor profile information captures that information that you're required to collect, and that you're actually considering it as part of your recommendation process, right? But yeah, I mean, I would, generally speaking, I would take a look at that staff bulletin. Another thing that they say in that bulletin is that and really as much as possible, as much as reasonably possible, you should be looking at the costs associated with the plan or the IRA that somebody is coming from, that's rolling, they're rolling from, right? There should be a comparison, a before and after comparison of what the cost situation is. And if there's a higher cost associated with a rollover, then that's not necessarily a fatal fact, right? That's not necessarily going to get you out or require you to kind of stop with the rollover recommendation, but there has to be a justification for the rollover recommendation that still makes the overall transaction in the customer's best interest. And and they provide some ideas in the staff bulletin regarding factors that you might want to look to in order to kind of establish that, notwithstanding the higher cost, these are the factors that that make this a best interest recommendation. So that that's what I would do. That's that would be the the number one thing I'd look at, is that guidance in that staff bulletin, and make sure that your policies and procedures include all of that, and that you've got processes in place, and something that's repeatable to make sure that you're following whatever you adopt.
Thanks for sharing that, Issa. And maybe this is a good point in the conversation to ask you, Randy. There seems to be this collision course between the rapid pace of regulatory change and firms trying to bring the right size solution, whether it's updating the process of procedures, putting training, developing technology. As you said off the top, you've worked over 25 years in the fintech space. What do you believe will help firms given where we are in the marketplace?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I think obviously biased towards a digital or some sort of an automated solution. It may not be for everybody, based on the size of your firm, but I think by and large, it's going to be something that people have to look for. And so what I tend to see, and what we try to, I think, advocate, is finding the right technology for you and your situation, right? I mean, everybody is gonna look to drive time savings, or increase transaction flow, or whatever those value driven factors are, and they're going to leverage integrations and the things I mentioned before, right? The adoption, the ease of use, alignment with your brand is a key one as well. There's intangible things in there also that we try to advocate for, and that's making sure that when you're talking to your solution provider, that they can act as more of a partner than just a vendor. I think there are a ton of systems out there and solutions out there that are they're good, they're going to do their job, and they're going to be great order takers, right? You're going to get information into them, they're going to churn it through the engine, get information out, and away you go. I think I want to urge people to think about people more like a collaboration, like a partner. Like when you go with this technology provider, you get somebody that's going to help you dig in, understand not only what you're asking for, but why you're asking for it, maybe challenge some of your thinking, and come collaboratively together with a solution. And I think if we do that, like if we can find that secret sauce within this collision point, Param, then we start to think about what you brought up at the beginning of the agenda, which is turning something that's typically a, oh gosh, I've got to be compliant conversation into a, how can I use this to grow my business conversation, right? And so the right technology gets easier to do things, assets in faster, advisor adoption, advisor retention, and even advisor recruiting. Like you see a lot of these firms out there that are really good at recruiting advisors to come join them. They're doing it because they've got a pretty solid tech stack and they've got good support for those advisors. And so typically that's something that we look at in the sales and the research side of the house. I think we have an opportunity here to include compliance technology in that same conversation now, because it is front and center. And that document, it's hard. Well, let's try to make it easier, and let's give them tools that can then help you guys grow your assets a little bit more outside the typical organic manner.
Love it. Thanks for sharing that, Randy. Ben, what are your thoughts on what Randy said? And what advice would you share with firms who are maybe tackling this stuff in a more manual basis?
Yeah, so I think, the tech stack part of what Randy mentioned is really, really important. I think, if you haven't started yet, as far as this Reg BI stuff is concerned, I mean, the original compliance date was June of 2020. So, it's time to get up and running, and I would say good luck. As far as manual processes go, what we found is that as we've built this out and sort of going from that initial compliance date until now, we've sort of evolved, and, we've used a little bit of a manual process with, and then added tech stacks along with that. But with the manual process, I mean, you're putting a lot of the onus there for the recommendation on both the rep making the recommendation to make sure that they've got all their ducks in a row. And then you're also putting that on your internal compliance staff to be able to interpret that and come up with a correct decision. And so it creates a lot of sort of extra work, where if you're able to sort of layer on a tech stack, and understanding that a lot of smaller broker dealers out there, they're not super excited about spending more money on technology for things like compliance. But that's part of you being able to go to sort of your senior management and say, hey, here's the situation, here's what the regulations say we need to do. And, here's why this technology solution is actually going to help us. It's going to save time, and it's going to help us explain our process when we are ultimately audited. I mean, I think a lot of this is about the idea of enforcement action avoidance, right? You don't want to be the firm that's on the bad side. And I think, the example we're using of unsecured corporate debt to unsophisticated investors, that's sort of low-hanging fruit with a lot of this stuff, but they're going to continue to sort of ramp that up, right? It's the low-hanging fruit now, but it'll get more and more sophisticated as to what they're looking at and what ultimately they're bringing as enforcement actions. The more stuff that's out there, the more sort of warning signals they've sent through, bulletins and things, enforcement actions to the field. So, if you're using that manual process, I would hope that you're able to defend it and make sure that you're very, very comfortable with the recommendations. But, as we get deeper and deeper into this Reg BI world, the norm is going to be that you've got some sort of tech stack involved with all this that helps you make your sort of brokers out there and your internal staff more efficient when they're evaluating all of this on the back end.
Thank you, Ben. That's definitely insightful, and thank you for sharing your views. Folks, I want to keep our promise to the audience and open the floor to a lightning round of questions. So our panelists, please come off mute. We're going to start peppering you with questions. Let's begin with a question that got trickled in, and I think it's a really good one, which is, do you feel that supervisors are now going to be held to higher accountability or standard for verifying that registered reps or IARs are recommending are making recommendations that's in the investor's best interest? Anybody want to tackle it?
I mean, I don't know that it's heightened supervisory responsibility. I think, even under the supervisory requirements that FINRA had in place before Reg BI, the supervisors were responsible. But the more specificity the SEC staff expects in implementing the care obligation with respect to a particular recommendation, the greater the onus on not just the rep, but the supervisor to make sure that that's done. So I don't know, the recommendations have to be approved. They're going to have to be reviewed. The supervisors are going to be held responsible. So, and again, another aspect of that enforcement case that is important is that the due diligence report on the L bonds did not go to the supervisors. So the supervisors need to be kept in the loop on these products as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Tom. Now, you mentioned something around best interest recommendations. There was another question in this that came in earlier around, is there a requirement to have a client sign or put their signature on that best interest acknowledgement / disclosure that's taking place? Any thoughts on that?
I'll take that one. I would say, don't use that as a crutch, right? You should really be looking to, your policies and procedures, your processes to kind of effectuate those policies and procedures, the training that you're doing with your reps, as your main arguments with the regulators that you're fulfilling your obligations under Reg BI. I think you can get if you implement one of these best interest acknowledgement disclosure requirements, I mean, you're essentially kind of saying to the regulators that we're outsourcing our best interest obligations to consumers, which is not a good look, right? So I would focus more on what you're doing internally, in terms of your policy procedures, your processes, your documentation, your training, to kind of show the regulators that you're meeting a best interest obligation, as opposed to having clients sign something that says essentially nothing more than you've done our work for us. So yeah, there's no requirement for a client to sign a best interest acknowledgement or a disclosure, and I don't think it really gets you very far in the eyes of the regulators.
Thanks, Issa. Okay, one more good question here, which is, if you show the regulators that you are over time improving the process around complying with the regulations, would they take that factor into consideration? That's the first part of the question.
Well, others can jump in. I think that the question, the answer depends on where you are at the moment. So if you're in an enforcement case, they don't really care. If you're in an exam, they may write you up, but at least not refer you to enforcement. So you just don't get a lot of mileage by saying, well, look how much better we are now when we're out of compliance than we were last year when we were really, really out of compliance. It just, the regulator expects you to have a supervisory system that has a reasonable chance of complying with Reg BI based on industry standards and what the SEC has said and FINRA said publicly. And the fact that you don't do it, but it's better than it was last year, is not going to get you much.
I will say, though, that as these kind of Reg BI cases start to come out, if you show a process where you're kind of meeting on a regular basis to kind of talk about those cases, the lessons learned, and then kind of improving processes over time in reaction to them, I think that does show good faith. So I think it makes a lot of sense to, essentially, carry over a process that you're probably already familiar with on the investment advisor side, where, you kind of react to big developments that are kind of communicated through cases, and make improvements as those cases come. Because at the end of the day, we do have a principles-based regime, right? There's a fair amount of room for interpretation here, especially under the care obligation. So, I think, in a way, it's almost kind of table stakes that you should be doing something like this on an ongoing basis as these cases start to develop, and as the regulators start to take a more kind of consistent and more like well communicated approach to how they interpret these requirements, and what the best practices are under Reg BI.
Yeah, I agree, Issa. I guess I was thinking from the perspective of an enforcement case.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think if you didn't do any of that, it just makes it worse.
Yep.
For you. But if you did it, it's kind of what was expected. The reason you should do those things, the reason you should consider a tech stack, the reason you should always be reviewing your procedures is to avoid the case entirely. Don't have an enforcement case. Don't get it written up on an exam. It's all essential, but you should always be trying to understand how you can improve your procedures based on what's come out of the commission, what you've seen by your, in your personnel, what they're selling, how they're selling. You should always be considering ways to improve.
Absolutely.
Don't wait till your exam to interpret what
Yeah.
the exam enforcers have been saying for the past 2 years.
Yes,
Essentially.
yes.
Of the insights, maybe we'll have time for a few more. Here's a good one. We actually get this question quite often, and hopefully to our panelists, you can shed some light on this. What if this is an RIA firm? And what is the level of discretion? And they have discretion around, I guess, investment choices in an account. What exactly do they need, or an RIA firm, to support investment choices?
Are we talking about in the rollover context, Param, or any context?
This, I think the question's asking about discretion around investments in an account. So after a rollover recommendation has been made.
Yeah, I mean, if you're an advisor, you're held to that Advisors Act fiduciary duty on an ongoing basis, right? So, you have an ongoing responsibility to ensure that every, action that you take in connection with a given account is in that, that client's best interest, right? So, in a way, the SEC and the staff have been making these pronouncements that they interpret, Reg BI's, care obligation and the Advisors Act fiduciary duty and its duty of care in substantially equivalent ways. So, I think you're essentially kind of held to the same, more or less obligations, right? In connection with every transaction that you make, is there a lower cost alternative for this client? Is there some alternative that I'm not considering that I should be? And, why is that alternative not in that, in this client's, best interest when this other one is? Like, I think you should absolutely be thinking about it in the same way. And there's actually guidance in the, in the 2 staff bulletins that have come out where they're saying essentially that, we think that these are substantially similar standards. So, we're going to carry over things like the reasonably available alternatives requirement, consideration of cost to, the fiduciary duty and the duty of care under the Advisors Act. They see them as very similar obligations.
I also think that an issue with the recommendation of an account type is going to more likely come up when you're bringing in an IA customer than a BD customer. If you recommend a broker-dealer account over an investment advisor account, typically I don't think it's as likely to be a problem because the fees generally are going to be lower. You're not charging an annual fee. It's funny because historically the opposite was true. There's always a concern that you're going to just churn. Obviously, if there's churning activity, that's a different problem. But nowadays, commissions, I think, are less of a concern because they're so small compared to the fee on the IA side.
Thank you for sharing this. Now, maybe we have time for one more quick question. I think, Issa, to your point about kind of the rollover recommendation versus a recommendation when an account has been opened or executed. Here's a question that talks about what's for an RIA with no BD affiliation, what's required to around sort of making the best interest recommendation and documentation perspective with respect to opening an IRA account or rollovers?
Yeah, I mean, in that situation where you don't have that client relationship yet, and you're making a rollover recommendation, I think you're, you've got a, under ERISA, a conflicted recommendation, and you have to find a prohibited transaction exemption, and to rely on in order to, essentially get the compensation that you expect to get when that person hires you as their investment advisor, right? So, in that situation, I think the general approach that we're seeing is, there's an expectation that that's fiduciary investment advice under the historical 5-part test under ERISA, and that folks are kind of getting underneath that PTE 2020-02, that relief, that that prohibited transaction exemption, in order to make that recommendation, that rollover recommendation.
Thank you, Issa. And we're just at time. So let me quickly say a sincere thank you to our audience for taking time out of your day to engage with us, ask questions. And as always, to our panelists, you have tremendous insights. And I can tell you from our audience's perspective that we certainly appreciate them. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.